Hello, I'm Patrick Abbott. I'm the author of the Fallen series, and today I'm really excited because I have Sara Light-Waller. And Sara is an inspiration to me. She's an expert in the pulp field, so I'm really, really, really excited to share her with you all and also her work, and hopefully you'll subscribe to her Substack. Sara, how are you today?
Rick, thanks. How are you?
Doing swell. So, before we kick it off, here's the most important question. What is going to make this interview interesting?
What is going to make it interesting? Well, as far as I'm concerned, talking about the pulps is interesting because it dips back into our history as science fiction fans. And it's a lot of the history that comes forward is not necessarily the way it was. And I like talking about the fans, the original fans, and what they were thinking about, so we can, and the editors, so we can get a better look at what the field really was like without all of the later stuff put on top of it. Does that make sense?
It does, and I'm already excited. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, generally, I've been a professional writer since 1985. I've written a lot of nonfiction as well as fiction. I've worked for publishers, I've worked for magazines, newspapers. I'm also a professional illustrator, and I've been doing that since my first book came out in 1990 with that. That was a children's book. So I've been in the field a long time. I've seen publishing change significantly. I come from a publishing family. My mother was a writer and editor and a book packager, and my ex-mother-in-law was a major editor at major magazines, Town and Country being one of them. So I come to writing and editing honestly. But I have been in love with the pulps for a really long time, and I'm interested in delving into them and what I call pulp archaeology. I bring things forward that have been lost and talk about them in new ways. I also write new pulp, which I do to create an experience for readers so that it's not just the writing, it's the style, it's the way the language is used, and the art as well. So I try to create a feeling glimpse into the past with my books. And I've put out several of them. I just put out my first pulp detective story, and I've got a couple of novels that will be coming out shortly.
I'm excited. And you also have the Substack, The Rocketeer. Do you want to give us a quick 30-second overview of that?
You bet. So I put out the Rocketeer podcast once a week. It's been going for over 3 years. And each week I talk about a different topic, a different pulp incident. This week that just came out right as we're recording this, I'm talking about the Henry Kuttner and C.L. Moore's story, Mimsy or the Borogoves, which is a very, very interesting story. It's packed with a lot of information, and of course, it's a reference to Alice Through the Looking Glass. So that just came out, and I go deep in depth on that story and connect it to other things. I like doing connections. There was a TV show in the 70s called Connections, and I always love that. So I do some of that in my...
And the game is awesome, too. So I was a kid and grew up on the reruns of Connections.
So you totally get it. I love that. I do not like doing straight reviews because, first of all, I don't like having to give bad reviews. But if it's an old story, I don't necessarily think that's enough. I can do it, but my opinion doesn't really matter that much. It's in contextual that matters to me. So The Rocketeer comes out at the same time every week, and it's can be 20 minutes. And I do it like that because I want it to be like a radio show. So it comes out on Wednesdays at 2:30 Pacific time.
And it's a highlight of my week, too. It comes out about 30 minutes after my Substack, so it's a little reward for me when it's a job well done, when I actually
you're so sweet.
able to hit publish. It's really good. People, if you haven't subscribed, do so. I'll include a link. Now, you keep using the noun pulp. What is pulp?
Before I get to that, my Substack is free. I don't want to take your money. I just, want to share information. So just wanted to put that in there. So don't worry about that. Pulp refers to an era of time that was bounded by a type of magazine printed on pulp paper. If you know about the paper newsprint, it was printed on essentially cheap newsprint paper that was created from pulp fibers. And the reason they did it is because it was very cheap. And there were other magazines, the nice ones like the Saturday Evening Post and Collier's and Ladies' Home Journal. Those were called the slicks because they were printed on much higher quality paper. There was definitely some interaction between writers and illustrators doing either or both. There was also interaction between the pulp type magazines and the comics. There was back and forth with those with writers and illustrators as well. But so we bound the type of magazine as a pulp because that's the cheap paper. Amazingly, a lot of it still exists, and I have seen clean copies of still almost white copies of things that were put out almost 100 years ago, but they're very highly preserved and they're very expensive.
I imagine
Mostly,
so.
though, yeah, the paper crumbles. It was never meant to be preserved, and in some genres, because there were many genres, and so people saved them. The science fiction fans always saved the magazines, but in other genres, for example, the love genre with like love story, people didn't always save them. So it's very difficult to get a full collection of those. Yeah. What else? Ask me other questions, and I'll keep going.
So here's an important thing I think that needs to be stressed about pulp. I'm really into the history of sci-fi, and recently I've been getting into reading what are known as the scientific romance novels, almost pre-World War I stuff. And it's fascinating to see the similarities in the field, but also the differences in tone between it and modern sci-fi. You start getting the sense this is a different speculative fiction drama genre. Mm-hmm. Yet pulp, it seems so much more like a lot of sci-fi nowadays. You get a lot of the tropes, similarities in the storylines, and at least what people stereotype what pulp is and sci-fi is, the bug-eyed monsters, things like that. What makes pulp so critical to science fiction heritage?
That's a really good question. And what you're talking about actually is a spectrum of stories. So we should clarify science fiction and scientific fiction and the scientific romance for people in case they don't understand those differences. So the term scientific romance was coined by H.G. Wells to describe the kind of stories that he wrote, which would have been anything, we would classify that as anything before 1926. And so not just him, but there were many, many people writing what we could classify today as scientific romance. Technically, anything that came out before Hugo Gernsback coined the term science fiction in 1926 counts as more like scientific romance or fantasy. They called it both of those things. There were probably some other terms as well, but those were probably the most common. Now, calling the pulps, they're not just paper. They were also a type of popular fiction that was put out on the newsstands. They weren't books. Generally, there were books in there coming out, but generally they were on the newsstands. The newsstands were packed with these magazines. And mostly they were looking at adventure stories of one sort or another. It could be, a plane story, an adventure involving a plane, or it could be a science fiction story, or it could be a romance on the other side of the world. But they tended to or a detective story, they tended to lump as adventures. So the history of science fiction goes from this scientific romance type of story, which were still adventures. They just hadn't been codified yet. So in 1926, Hugo Gernsback brought out the first issue of Amazing Stories, and he wrote an essay called A New Type of Magazine, which described what he wanted to do with science fiction, which was first called scientifiction in early days. And his goal was to tell stories that would inspire kids really to be interested in science. And that's where we begin to see the very roots of hard science fiction as we know it today. And it goes through a number of growth stages, but that's the very beginning. Now, not everybody wanted those hard science fiction stories, but Amazing was very popular in the early days, so other publishers came in and they wanted to have a piece of the pie. They already might have had magazines in the Western genre, the detective genre, but they wanted to add to their stable of magazines this new fantastic science fiction genre. Now, there were magazines that had science fiction stories in them, but they weren't devoted to them like Amazing Stories was. So you have Weird Tales that came out in 1923, which included science fiction and fantasy stories, but it was not devoted to them because it had a lot of horror in there too. And then you had Science and Invention, which was going on at the same time as Amazing Stories, but had started earlier. That was another one of Hugo Gernsback's magazines, and it's a very interesting magazine in totality, but he did start putting science fiction stories into that before Amazing. Am I gabbing too much? Do you want to ask questions? I'll stop. You ask a question and I'll keep going.
So I'll make a remark, and if you want to take it from there or just continue, this is all fascinating. I really was struck by the line you said, science fiction in part was coined to make people interested in science, and especially growing up in the 80s and 90s, so many people I met who were into astronomy, because I was into astronomy and space as a child, mentioned Star Trek, how that really got them excited about the science of space travel and things like that. And I wonder, you don't hear that much anymore about people being inspired by science fiction for science. Maybe it's just because it's not marketed or promoted as such, but I think that's important to our storytelling, that what are the purposes of the story? And maybe that's just me musing to myself, but that line really struck me.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, the stories, there was a big controversy with the early fans, first fans, about, and there were groups that were interested in, no, science fiction or science fiction has to be just about science. These fantasy kind of stories, they're right out. We don't like them. That's not what our fan club is about. And then there were other fan clubs that said, no, we want to have pseudoscience. It's okay. We're telling these great speculative stories. It's really all right. So there was a tension immediately about that. And
Star Trek versus Star Wars, even right off the bat.
Yes, right, exactly. Now, I'm going to jump ahead. I'll come back to the pulps for a second, but a very interesting thing started happening in the 50s. Technically, it's considered the end of the pulp era is in 1953, approximately. That has a lot to do with post-war paper shortages. It has to do with the rise of paperback books. It has to do with a change in the nature of what people said they wanted in the science fiction genre. They wanted, and there's a long, deep story. We can talk about this another time. It's very, very interesting. But essentially, they wanted science fiction to become more intellectual, more psychological, more shallower humor, essentially, and more contemporary issues. They wanted to get rid of the adventure story part. This was the literary movement for science fiction in the 50s. And it was shoved in that direction. And we begin to see some very strange things happen to science fiction in the late 50s into the 60s. And that's where Star Trek comes into the picture. But in the 60s, you still see pulp-type stories in TV shows. In fact, Star Trek was very pulpy. I mean,
Wagon Trains to the Stars, yeah.
Exactly. And Kirk is very much a pulp hero, but Spock isn't. So you see this in various kind of shows. You see, like Lost in Space in black and white was actually, Lost in Space is interesting because I saw the original pilot for it, and they made some changes to the pilot. And the original pilot, have you ever seen it?
Not the original pilot, no.
Okay, that's fascinating because in it, Don West is not the pilot. He's Professor Robinson's assistant, and he's in love with Judy, of course. And that is a very pulp triangle. That is very, very consistent through the pulps. You had a professor who was older, you had a young assistant who was brilliant, and you had a girl who was the daughter or the niece or something. And it was the young assistant and the girl who ended up being the heroes, really, with the assistance of the professor. Very pulpy. But they got rid of it, and the change they made, I think it was a good change, to the story, but they pushed it into the 60s with that change. Very interesting. So, but everything so shows like Lost in Space, like Time Tunnel, like Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea were all very pulpy, but they had relegated it at that point to a children's audience, which is ironic because science fiction in the pulps was always a young man, usually, although women were reading it, but a young man's domain. So it's kind of interesting, that similarity, but yeah, so and then but for mainstream movies in the 60s, we have some very strange things happening that would never have been seen in the pulp era. Heroes dying bad deaths. And I mean, Charlton Heston, several of his movies, he's a hero who dies bad deaths, senseless deaths. You would never see that in the pulp era.
Soylent Green and whatnot.
Yeah, the second Planet of the Apes movie and Andromeda Man, that was the I Am Legend, early version of the I Am Legend franchise. Senseless deaths. Never, ever, ever. But that was part of this very psychological, very... It wasn't like heartfelt anymore. The pulps were really about humanity and human adventures and human, unities in some ways.
And overall positivism.
Right, hopeful. And then, but so in the 60s, we see this movement in the 70s to really not hopeful. And that leads us to back to your question about science fiction not being inspiring anymore. People have gotten fatigue with some of this, and they've moved, in my opinion, they've moved into fantasy, and they started doing that heavily in the 80s. And now fantasy is just very, very strong in the market. And so we have all of these micro genres, and everybody's trying to figure out where they fit, but there's no overarching really, it's hard to say, I love hard science fiction. It's just hard to say that, I think, because it's lost something. Does that make sense?
It does. And I recall once I was at a movie festival, and they were showing The Thing that from Another World, what The Thing is based on. And they talked...
the Campbell story.
Yep. And they're talking about the role of the doctor. And after World War II, there was a shift from kind of the science... Beforehand, it was science is part of the adventure. It's part of humanity's growth. And just seeing the atomic bomb and other anxieties of the era, scientist characters and scientific themes became a negative, where the scientist doesn't want to destroy the monster, that it's hampering us. It's letting that evil out. And so I never thought about just overarching tying it in with pulp, just this sort of societal shift of this anxiety coming on.
That's very interesting. And you're absolutely right. The big blow-up stories in the 40s, the atomic war stories, they refer to them as big blow-up stories. And we have versions of those today. We just don't call them the same thing, and the outcome is not atomic war for us. But we have plenty of post-apocalyptic, types of stories, as you know.
Oh, yeah. Netflix just released one, too. I forget what it's called, but it's about a potential nuclear strike on the United States, and just there's a lot of anxiety in the field, and you can see that reflected by culture.
Right. Plus, there's a lot of wrist slapping. You can't write that. You have to write this. You can't say that. You mustn't talk like that. It's there's limitations that we just didn't see back before the mid-50s, I think. And now you have to make excuses. I don't, but you have to make excuses for the way things were written back in the 40s and 30s and 20s. Culturally, I mean, I have 2 degrees in anthropology personally, so I'm really sensitive to cultural issues, but I'm also very aware that things change, and this is not the same culture I grew up in as a child. It's very different. So I still may not be able to legitimately study it as an anthropologist, but I can be aware of these changes and just say, we're not the same culture we were 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, or
The past
70.
truly is a different country. And
Mm-hmm.
with my geography degree, the bachelor's was an undergraduate, and so I had to read a lot of Leslie White, the Berkeley School of Cultural Geography, things like
Mm-hmm.
that. And so when I
Mm-hmm.
was especially overseas, a lot of that I learned just how the cultural ins and outs and how to relate that. And when applying to stories that I write, especially the Fallen series, some of the initial feedback I got was they can't do that. That's mean, or that's bad, and it's a different culture. It's what they do.
Mm-hmm. Right, right, right. And essentially that's how I look at, in a way, those old stories. And I have an interest in well, see, I'm one of the few women in the field of, as a pulp historian, there just aren't too many women. And so I end up looking at things like the roles of women and women writers, but I don't look at it from a feminist perspective. I look at it from more of a general cultural perspective. And that's unusual. And I have some projects in mind for the future that may include that, because I want to talk more honestly about who these women were. I don't want to put them in a box. Some of them were mothers, some of them were young wives, some of them were, these are fans and writers, some of them were housewives, and these stories by these women get dumped into this is a feminist treatise books today. And I don't think that's right. I don't think, based on letters that they wrote, based on people talking to them, they weren't feminists. And in fact, I just ran across a marvelous quote from Lee Brackett. You know who she was, right?
I do, but you want to inform our viewers.
Okay. Lee Brackett was a very well known female science fiction fan, also a scriptwriter in Hollywood. And she wrote the first treatise for the Empire Strikes Back script, actually. But she was working in Hollywood back decades before that. She was also married to Edmund Hamilton, who is one of my personal favorite pulp writers. But Brackett wrote a lot of pulp fantasy and science fiction. And she had a quote in a fan magazine that I just ran across that said she had a problem with the, in quotes, feminist fans because they ended up becoming very aggressive. And I thought, that's a fantastic quote because that's what we see sometimes today. I mean, I have nothing against feminist fans. I have nothing against feminists. I'm
Right,
a friend
right.
to everyone. But I don't like to see I don't like to see a large amount of aggression in any fan because we can't have a dialogue that way.
It's the problem with any ideology. If you take it too far, you force people into your box, and if they don't naturally fit in, you get angry and then you lash out.
Exactly, exactly.
So we spent.
So
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to hand it over to you.
Oh, okay. So we spent a lot of time talking about kind of the phasing out of pulp. But is pulp still with us in any way, shape, or form? Because when I think back to pulp, I think about the adventure stories, that sort of funness, that hope. And while it's been a little while now, I think to the 90s with movies like Stargate and even The Fifth Element, and I consider that pulpy. Do we still have pulp in sci-fi?
That's a tough question. I don't read a lot of contemporary sci-fi, so I can't give you a 100% honest answer, but I can tell you that the underpinnings of the genre, the way it used to be, is not often purely done today because the publishing industry, even the indie publishing industry, because of what people want to read, does not support it. If you told I mean, maybe there's plenty of it I just haven't seen, but from what I've seen, some of the underlying ideas, like the concept of the characters are stand-ins for doing something good for humanity. Often they'll sacrifice their life or put their life on the line because the bigger issue, the bigger goal, and like the Doc Smith's Lensman series, for example, and you know about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so all of those characters they're people, but they're not people. They're really they're symbolic of a much bigger issue, and everybody loves the Lensman even today. So I don't know who's doing stories like that. I know that it's not a popular concept in mainstream. I'm doing it because I love those concepts, and I have an idea that I call neotopia. I don't like utopias. I don't like dystopias, and we're surrounded by people telling dystopic stories.
Yeah,
But
it's a
my
major seller, especially in the young adult market.
and it's all about that adrenaline rush that leaves you feeling terrible after because you're like, well, okay, so the world's going to be better off without me and all the rest of my group. Oh, how nice.
Yeah,
You
it's
know,
an anti-pulp.
it is. And my idea with neotopia is that humanity is in a process of evolvement and it's a messy process. But ultimately, humans will step up and say, you know what, we actually want a more unified society. We don't want to live in these little boxes, and we don't have to be really nasty to each other. But it takes a while. And that in one of my first pulp story called Landscape of Darkness, and the second, another one called Incorruptible, I actually explore this. And so I think this is like a really important thing, but it's, my idea.
So one thing we've talked a little bit about hinting at is fandom and people's responses. But beforehand, you were talking with me before we recorded about fandom magazines, fandom letters. What was pulp fandom like?
It was a wild west. It was crazy. It got, Hugo Gernsback in Amazing actually he was the first one who actually supported fandom in a magazine and didn't ridicule it. So he put notices in the back about local fan groups, and he supported fans writing to each other, and if you wrote in a letter, you were supposed to send in your address, which is horrifying to us today, but send in your address so that people could correspond with you because pen pals are really a big deal. So fan groups started right away in the late 20s, and they developed this incredibly deep fan culture. And you see it in the pro magazines, the proper pulp magazines, and then you see there were hundreds of fanzines, from teeny weeny little typed sheets to handwritten stuff and to just beautifully presented semi-pro magazines. And there was crossover between some of the writers that, like H.P. Lovecraft. There was a whole fanzine that was based around him and called The Acolyte. And it took a long time really to take off. It didn't make a lot of money for a while. But then at some point, somebody realized, oh my God, this is H.P. Lovecraft stuff. It's being published here. I just read a poem by Lovecraft that had never been published anywhere else. It wasn't a very good poem, but it was still Lovecraft. So
I got my own thoughts about Lovecraft, so I'm sorry.
Well, but he's just an example. You see everybody in there somewhere. I mean, Bob Tucker, I don't know if you know him. He was a really very well-known writer at the time, and lots of people. Yeah, I mean, and you see these fans coming up. Like Henry Kuttner started as a fan, and he became, a fairly important writer in the genre, and you see that with Chad Oliver too. Do you know who he is, Chad Oliver?
That I do not.
There are very few people that are classified as anthropological science fiction writers, and he is one, and Ursula Le Guin is the other one, because she was Al Kroeber's daughter. He was a real famous anthropologist. So technically there's only two that are recognized. And but Oliver came up as a fan. He was like a super fan in that. You see his letters in a magazine called Planet Stories, and so you see him come up, and then he goes to college, and then he gets his degree in anthropology, and then he goes into this field and becomes a really well-known writer in the field. So if you trace fandom, you see all of this. You see people talking about going to visit the two Superman creators, Schuster and Siegel and Schuster. They go to their house. They're like, okay, I'm visiting so-and-so and so-and-so. I'm going to go over and see if they're home. And they knock on the door, and one of them is home, and then they go see the other one. So you see this in fandom. It's crazy. And we're like, okay, this is the guy who started this, and this is the guy who did this, and this is the creator of this, and they were just kids, and so they were having barbecues with their families together, or going to all early conventions, talking about the early conventions in the 30s and the first World Science Fiction Convention in 39. It's crazy.
That's amazing. So we don't have to get too into it, but was pulp kind of the start of science fiction conventions?
Oh, well, for sure. It happened in the pulp era. They were there, in the 30s, these fan groups were getting together, and it was through them that the first convention started. So I think the first science fiction convention ever was in 36. And then there was one or two more before the World Science Fiction Convention in 39, the first one. And so they had some awards, and everybody was there, and there were big blow-ups of people yelling at each other and other people walking out and making a big fuss. But the point was,
Some things are
suddenly,
universal.
yes, yes, but it was started, and it was who was talking about what magazine and what story was in what magazine, and they weren't talking about books. That really, they were talking about the magazine. Some of the books, there were some books they were talking about, but it wasn't like today. Mostly it was coming through the magazines.
That's amazing. And it's another thing, just the legacy of pulp. We have Comic-Con, the computer and video game industry once had E3, BlizzCon, all these big conventions that are huge marketing devices for companies that are profit makers, all because of pulp. I did not know that.
There may have been conventions of other sorts in the 30s, but I'm not aware of them. And I'm not talking, industry conventions. I'm talking about, fun conventions. I'm not aware of them. I don't know when the first Detective Con was, for example. I could look it up, but I don't know. So this is just science fiction and fantasy. But it seems like that's where it was all coming from.
That's really interesting. Another interesting thing that it was about 2 weeks ago or so from this recording. You had a recent post about Lilith Lorraine and the brain of the planet, which if you're anywhere near a libertarian, it's a nightmare story. But the thing that struck me was there was the angle and influence of theosophy in the story. And just something on the side that I've been researching, because I like to do research on the idea of aliens and different religions and from an objective point of view. And one thing that's just coming up again and again, no matter what the faith, but just the influences of theosophy. So briefly, for people who don't know, theosophy is I would say, a new religious movement from the late 1800s. And it's incredibly complex, but boiling it down to probably way past its boil point is that there are ascended masters, these spirits, otherworldly creatures, if you will, that have advanced knowledge that selectively, if you focus on that, you'll get almost a Gnostic greater knowledge and free. What can you tell us about theosophy and its influence on pulp and therefore science fiction?
Well, there's definitely threads of spiritualism of various sorts running through the early pulps and pre-pulps. I would call that, well, going back, I was actually thinking about this going back to the 1910s. There's all sorts of, and I think we chatted about this a little bit, didn't we?
We did. So originally, just for a viewer's side note, I thought I could tap into Sara as a little bit of a resource. Her answer blew me away, and I thought, there's no way I can do this topic justice when there's an expert right here.
Oh, well, yeah, it's very interesting. There seems to have been a very strong pulse of the theosophy in the early pulps before you get, well, it travels through it. I mean, you see weird tales, you see stories that are all about reincarnation. And, my question is, why were they talking about reincarnation in the 1910s? Whose idea was that? I mean, I know personally that, because my family was part of this, the transcendental meditation movement really did not start in this country, in the U.S., until the 50s and 60s. So where were they getting this idea that people could be reincarnated in 1910? And there's lots of books. There's all sorts of, and I collect some of them. I haven't read them all, but there's a treatise on the goddess Kuan Yin going back to the 1915, and all these things. There was a woman who wrote about multiple loves and multiple lives, going in the 1910 area, and it's like, what is this all coming from? So it's got to be coming from the late 19th century and the spiritualism movements of various sorts. It has to be, because I can't find any other connection there. So this runs through. I think that a lot of the editors discouraged high spiritual stories in some of the pulp magazines. You're not going to see that in a Western genre magazine, for example. You might find a Christian, maybe, but I think they were discouraging a lot of religion in these adventure magazines generally. But you do see stories in the science fiction about past lives and future lives and repeating lives, and going back and having time slips, and it's just really, really interesting. But you've got to pull it out, because if you stick with some authors, you'll never find it. So
agreed. On my own end with the scientific romance, John Jacob Astor IV, who died on the Titanic.
Yes, I know what you're going to say.
Journey in the Other Worlds.
Yep.
So it's just something I'm looking into and trying to figure out how to write about it. But I don't know if it's just pure theosophy or just more spiritual Christianity, esotericism. I think it's Jupiter or maybe Neptune that they visit on their tour of the solar system. And there's souls of people there and bishops, and they talk about this is how you're going to die. And it's not an overwhelming drive, but there's definitely in different stories that this is getting somewhere, and where exactly where it's going, I don't know.
Well, there's connection that you can, with people being on other planets and spirits being on other planet. That goes back to ancient Greece, and in the what might be the first science fiction story that was published way, way back. But you definitely see that in Cyrano de Bergerac's two science fiction stories from the 17th century. There is definitely a sense of people who've died living on other planets. That does come into it. And have you ever read A Voyage to Arcturus by, what's his name?
So it is on my read list, but for the listeners, what do you think is the most important bit about that?
I think it's a metaphor. I think the whole thing is a metaphor for ascension out of this reality. No one's ever said that before, but that was my impression when I read it. Everything that he talks about, the changes that go through this character's body as he goes to Arcturus and has these very, very psychedelic adventures, which are very strange for 1923, or whenever it came out. I think it's a metaphor for ascending consciousness, actually. Because it's very weird. It's way too psychedelic for anything that came out before 68, really.
Yeah, when I was a lot younger, I tried reading it, and I failed. So it actually is on my reading plan. So when I get back to it, I'll let you know.
Because it's a very, very, very strange book, and it's strangely placed. But the author did not sell many copies. He sold like a handful of them, and he was like a minister or something. I'm blanking on his name, and I shouldn't be. I've got it like right in the next room, but I'm not going to go get it. Yeah, very strange. Sometimes people still tell stories that are out of time. They don't belong when they told them, and that's one of them. I think it was almost like it could, if it had been told in the 60s, like in the drug era, it would have made sense.
Yeah, I had that psychedelic painted cover on the book. People would have bought it.
Yeah, but it came out in 1923 or whatever, and it just did not fit with the culture. But it seeded the culture, And I think that that is happens with many science fiction stories, like Lorraine's story, the Brain of the Planet, which is interesting because it it's part of a period of time where they were telling a lot of pro-eugenics stories.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fascinating to me because there really was a time before World War II when you could do that. And there was a lot of question in society, how do we improve the stock? And not in a Nazi way, but, in a general, we know something about genetics now, maybe we can do something with that. It was interesting.
It's definitely a thing that sort of a lot of people gloss over, and my home state of South Dakota in the Progressive era went all in on that, and it was extreme laws on who you could marry, talk about racial hygiene, which the states never got into the detail, but if you read some of the pamphlets, it was, they're going to get this one way or the other. And my running theory is science fiction is dreams of the future. Not all dreams are pleasant to a current reader, but that was a dream society had back then. With science, we can make us better.
What was the date that you're talking about? Dates?
The 1920s, especially.
The 20s was the era of this. There was a great interest in this in the 20s, and it wasn't. It was there was a lot of hope associated with it in ways that we don't have anymore. This wasn't it wasn't meant to be a control structure. I think it was meant to be truly improving things for everybody. I'm not defending it, I'm just saying, but modern people have a mental block about talking about eugenics after World War II. We won't talk about it. I was trying to read an early eugenics story I had to do a review for a column, and I almost couldn't read it. I had to read a first issue of a pulp magazine, and the lead story was a eugenics story, and I'm like, I can't read that. I'm not allowed to read that. And I forced myself past the mental block and did read it and was able to start processing what this was really about. Beyond the I don't approve of this level, I went into more of an academic level with it. And it was fascinating because it started me in a journey to pay attention to this, which is very interesting because it pervades society. Something happened after World War II, and I'm not speaking against anything that we believe for World War II, that it didn't happen or that, anything about anybody. But we did have a mental block put on us where we can't talk about it now. Some people talk about it all the time, and some people are involved in it because we know that we have cloning after Dolly the sheep. We know that we have some people talking about cultural purities and things, and we still have that, but we're not allowed to talk about it, really, except what's been approved by, like the media. We can talk about that. So...
Yeah, and that's an amazing point. I was recently on a panel, and it was, what do you think is the next big science fiction issue the Catholic Church and society will face? And pretty much all of us agreed it wasn't necessarily AI, but more the genetic aspects of genetic engineering, CRISPR, gene editing, all that sort of thing, with bringing in COVID too. And it was just, we don't get that much in sci-fi, and especially with science fiction being a field where we can really tackle issues like that. The last big sci-fi event that really tackled that issue was Gattaca, which is one of my favorite movies. And you're right, we just have this sort of cultural mind block on that.
So the question is, for the more people who are aware of this, I think it becomes an issue of like the 100th monkey syndrome. If enough of us start talking about making science fiction speculative again, really speculative the way it was, without gatekeepers, what does that do for the field? And I'll turn that back over to you because I think it's a really interesting point of discussion.
Yeah, as I said and say elsewhere, science fiction is our dreams of the future. And if we don't dream, even if they're bad dreams, we don't think about problems, and if those problems come up, we haven't thought about them.
And what are we afraid of is my question. You know, if we science fiction is a playground for ideas. We're not actually, you know, we're not building these machines, although it might lead to them being built. So the question is, can we build a society that is where, as you say, we're more able to dream again? I think we're not encouraged to dream in that way now. And it's one of the reasons why people really enjoy fantasy, especially high fantasy, because there's a playground there, but it's more limited. The bounds on the sides are the walls are bigger,
Mm-hmm.
you know. So, but the old science fiction, the real speculative, before we had hard science fiction and romantic science fiction and all the little teeny pieces of it, can we go back there and start playing with these ideas again? I think it's really important. And if we did, I think our conversations would get bigger and wider, deeper and wider again.
So this is where I issue the call for people to go out and search the indies for science fiction that actually dreams and can inspire you and are the genres you're interested in. On that
Here,
note,
here.
on that note, we have you. So here's a multi-part one. What books have you written? Where can people get them? And since I'm going to buy one, which one should I start out with?
Well, most of my books are on Amazon, and you can find. And I've just done a site rebuild on my Lucina Press website, but it's not up yet. So you can go to it now, and it's my old site, and it's fine. And you can find all the books there, and you can you can find all the books there and sample chapters and everything. My newest book, Shadow on the Moon, I pulled from everything because I found that I wanted to add something to the front matter. It was kind of in its introductory release. And so I'm doing that now. I will re-upload that to Amazon within the next few days, so it will be available. So my books to date are Landscape of Darkness, which is 1940s science fiction, pulp style. Incorruptible, which is a post-apocalyptic story that is the origin of the Landscape of Darkness reality. You know, it's 200 years before. It's what sets up that future world. Anchor, A Strange Tale of Time, which is an introductory story to a novel that I'm going to be putting out within the next couple of months about a group of people called timekeepers. They're multidimensional beings. These stories are in the style of, I would say, science fantasy, because they have a very strong philosophical, energetic, spiritual bent to them. Not any particular religion, but more of that. And so the new book will be coming out associated with that. And then I have my first detective story. It's a new Moon Man story. This character, he was a very popular detective hero from the 1930s, originally written by Frederick C. Davis, and they came out in a magazine called 10 Detective Aces. And the Moon Man was the most popular character in that magazine in the mid-30s. So the character went into the public domain, and I wanted to try my hand at writing him. So this is my first detective story, and that just came out in time with Worldcon this year, where I was there. And then I wrote an award-winning story, which is called Battle at Neptune, I rewrote the end of Cosmos, which was the first shared world science fiction round-robin story from 1933 and 34. And the end was always considered weak. It was written by 17 different authors, many of whom are very popular and are still popular today from back then. So Edmund Hamilton wrote the last chapter, and I rewrote it, and it won the Cosmos Prize, and I illustrated it as well. And so that story, you can read it online for free, and it's also come out in a new edition called The Ultimate Cosmos by First Fandom Experience, just came out, where the whole book is printed of the original Cosmos story with lots of backup information and fan information and pictures and all sorts of great stuff. And my story's in there. So, and really cool, I got a very nice comment from Robert Silverberg about my story, and I spoke with him at Worldcon. He was just so sweet. And I was on a panel with him, and he thought the story was terrific. So that was really cool.
Awesome.
So those are my stories to date. Like I said, I have 2 novels that will be coming out fairly soon. The first one's with my really good beta reader right now, so I want to make sure that he doesn't find anything, and then I'll get it ready. And they're all illustrated. Not heavily illustrated like graphic novels, but they're illustrated the way pulp magazines were, with a few illustrations and then the covers.
You forgot the most important bit. Which one am I starting off with? And that reader should start off as well.
Right. Well, you might want to start out with Landscape of Darkness. It's gotten
Landscape of Darkness, okay.
The best reviews. It's hard to get people to review things. Ironically, I get reviews from people like Robert Silverberg and Greg Bear, but I don't get and like Tom Johnson, who did a fanzine for years and years, but I don't get reviews from other people. It's very weird.
So review your books, people. Us indie authors and small publisher authors, we live and die on that. And even a bad review is, hey, you've paid attention. Obviously, the good reviews put us on cloud 9, but put a review.
I know, it's so true. Well, Landscape has, I think, 6 5-star reviews, maybe more, and all of them are saying we feel like we were reading, I picked up an old pulp magazine and was reading a really good story in it. So, do I have time to mention something else? It's just trivia. So I haven't mentioned it anywhere else, but let me know if I've
We have all the time in the world.
So I realized this is brand hot off the presses. I've not mentioned it to anyone yet, so I want to mention it here because it's really, really cool. So Patrick, do you know about the old pulp hero called Captain Future?
So I'm going to admit I'm a nerd, and yes.
Okay, written by Edmund Hamilton mostly, but he was very popular in Europe because of the anime that came out in the 60s, 70s, I think. It never went well here because the translations were always bad. But he became super popular in Europe, and then in Japan too. So one of the stories that's considered not one of the best in the series is called The Birthplace of Creation, and it's toward the end of the series, I think. And I always thought it was fascinating because Captain Future and his team go to very far away to a place where all of this matter is spewing out of a central location, and with it, matter is being created. And I thought, yeah, I really like that. That's a really cool idea. Well, recently I've been doing some research into plasma beings and dusty plasma particles. The descriptions I've seen so far sound exactly like what Edmund Hamilton was talking about in The Birthplace of Creation. It's very, very interesting. So I'm wondering, because he knew stuff. I mean, I've talked about him in my podcast before. He has all these ideas, like Murray Leinster did too, these ideas that are really ahead of their time. Very interesting. It's possible that story that was considered not one of the best Captain Future stories was talking about plasma beings or the way plasma clouds work. I mean, I haven't done a huge amount of research yet on this, but it's very, very interesting. So that's my tidbit.
It's amazing just what being into science fiction, either as an author or a consumer, does to a person. What you're researching plasma clouds. I research religions and philosophies and how the moon and Earth, how the Earth looks from the moon. We go into some very interesting books and sources to make a good story for y'all.
Well, I think that's what real speculative science fiction is. It's letting down the boundaries and saying what kind. So, getting back to Lilith Lorraine and The Brain of the Planet for a second, she was doing that. At her time in the 20s, she was letting down boundaries. Leslie Stone, who I really like as an early female science fiction writer, in the 30s. She was doing that too in some really interesting ways, but you have to allow yourself to get into their mindset a little bit so that you can appreciate a little bit of what their perspective was. Because from their perspective, they wouldn't know what the heck we were talking about. And not just because we're talking about science that has progressed, but our mindset is so, I was going to say polluted, but that's not the right word.
It is
But
different. They're different influences.
yeah, we've had so many decades of various kinds of social conditioning. They had it too, but it was different. So people read these old stories and they're like, well, I can't relate to that in any way. And, you know, I don't want to. I'm told that this, that, and the other thing shouldn't happen. But I really like to look at that. Like all the people who were interested in by Charles Fort's work, you know, so many science fiction writers were influenced by his work. And yet really all he did was write lists.
Yeah,
He didn't
here's
really
some weird
have
things going on
philosophies.
in the world.
Yeah, yeah, and but that was a jumping off point for many science fiction writers. So
So,
interesting.
lastly, the most important question with everybody listening in, what do you want to tell them?
Ooh, what do I want to tell them? Try not to limit yourself, folks. I mean, the whole idea of speculative anything is to dream. So Patrick's absolutely right. Dreams of the future, but dreams of the now as well. Because we are changing. We are being affected by everything that's happening around us and everything that's happening in the solar system too. I mean, I've talked obliquely about Three Eye Atlas and all the comets that are currently in our system. Now, whatever they are, whether they're comets or aliens or ancient technology, people have been speculating on things like that in the pulp era. I could give you a list of at least half a dozen stories without even looking them up that encompass that kind of idea. But everyone's becoming very fractured and frightened right now. There's a lot of social instability seemingly happening on all social medias. But beyond all of these temporal issues is a much bigger picture. We might possibly be on the threshold of some incredibly exciting advances, not just in external science, but inner science too. So let your mind dream and figure out what that is and talk about it. That's really exciting. That's my feeling.
Awesome. Sara, I wanted to thank you so much for doing this. This has been a great conversation.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having the conversation. And if you ever want to have another one, let me know.
Same here. This has been a blast. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.